September 14, 1943. Camp Omori. A prisoner of war compound on Tokyo Bay. The radio crackled to life at precisely 1900 hours, the same time every evening, and 200 American prisoners stopped whatever they were doing to listen. Not because they were allowed to listen. Not because the Japanese guards encouraged it. But because the voice that came through the static was American. Lieutenant Thomas Wade sat against the wall of the barracks, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 40 pounds in 4 months. The evening air carried the smell of boiled rice and industrial smoke from the factories across the bay. Around him, men shifted closer to the speaker, their faces hollow, their eyes fixed on the wooden radio box mounted near the ceiling. The program began the way it always began. Soft music. American jazz. Glenn Miller's orchestra playing Moonlight Serenade. 3 minutes of melody that sounded like home. Then the voice. "Good evening, boys." The accent was unmistakable. Midwestern. Flat vowels. The kind of voice that could have come from Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas. Friendly. Familiar. Almost gentle. This is your pal 0 Hour bringing you music and news from Tokyo. Around Wade, men exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Others stared at the floor. A few smiled bitterly. They all knew what was coming next. The voice continued, smooth and conversational, like a radio announcer back in the States talking about the weather or a baseball game. But the words were different. The words were poison. "I know you boys are tired. I know you're wondering when this war will end. Well, let me tell you something your commanders won't tell you." Wade closed his eyes. He'd heard this broadcast 11 times now. 11 evenings listening to an American voice tell American prisoners that their country had abandoned them, that their families had forgotten them, that the war was already lost. Your Navy just lost 3 carriers in the Coral Sea. Your B-17s are burning over Germany. Your boys are dying in the Pacific while Roosevelt sits in Washington making deals with Stalin. Some of the information was true. Wade knew that. The Navy had taken losses. The air war over Europe was brutal. But the rest was propaganda. Carefully crafted lies mixed with selective facts to break morale, to make men doubt, to make them give up. The voice on the radio wasn't Japanese. It was American. And that made it worse. "I was one of you once. I wore the uniform. I believed the promises. But then I saw the truth." Wade opened his eyes and looked around the barracks. Most of the men were listening with expressions he couldn't quite read. Anger? Recognition? Something else? Next to him, Corporal James Sullivan whispered, "That's not possible." Wade turned. "What?" "That voice." Sullivan's face had gone pale. "I know that voice." Wade studied him. Sullivan was from Boston, 24 years old, shot down over the Philippines in January. He'd been at Omori for 7 months. "You're hearing things," Wade said. But Sullivan wasn't listening. He was staring at the radio with a look Wade had never seen before. Not anger. Not confusion. Recognition. "That's Charlie," Sullivan said quietly. "That's Charlie Preston." The name meant nothing to Wade. But around them, other men were sitting up straighter, leaning forward, their attention suddenly sharp. "No way," someone said from across the barracks. "It's him," Sullivan insisted. "I flew with him. Same squadron. 19th Bomb Group. I'd know his voice anywhere." The broadcast continued, the friendly voice delivering its evening dose of demoralization and doubt. But now the barracks was different. Men were whispering, arguing in low voices, shaking their heads. Wade had been a prisoner for 16 weeks. He knew the patterns. He knew how propaganda worked. The Japanese brought in American newspapers months old, showed them articles about strikes in Detroit factories, about protests in California. They played radio broadcasts from Tokyo Rose and other English-speaking announcers designed to make prisoners feel abandoned. But he'd never seen men react like this. Because this wasn't just propaganda. This was betrayal. After the broadcast ended, Sullivan sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Charlie Preston was my roommate in flight school. We went through training together. Got assigned to the same squadron in Manila. I was there when his B-17 went down over Rabaul in February. We all thought he was dead. Wade didn't know what to say. Around them, other men were having similar conversations. Low, urgent exchanges. Names being confirmed. Memories being shared. Sergeant Daniel Morrison pushed his way through the crowded barracks. Sullivan's right. That's Preston. I met him in the Philippines. Talked to him 3 days before his plane went missing. Maybe it's someone who sounds like him, Wade suggested. Morrison shook his head. He has a scar. From a training accident. Burned his hand on an engine. Used to joke about it. Called himself half-baked Preston because the doctor said his hand looked like it had been in an oven. Sullivan nodded slowly. He mentioned that in tonight's broadcast. Said something about understanding what it's like to be burned by your own equipment. That's Charlie. That's definitely Charlie. The realization spread through the barracks like fever. One of their own was broadcasting for the enemy. Not a Japanese announcer pretending to be American. Not a propaganda actor trained to sound friendly. But an actual American pilot. Someone they knew. Someone who had worn the same uniform, flown the same missions, faced the same dangers. And now his voice came through the radio every evening telling them their country had abandoned them. October 1943. 4 weeks after the identification. The evening broadcasts became different after that first night. Men listened with a new intensity, trying to understand not just what was being said, but why it was being said. Wade watched as Sullivan and Morrison huddled near the radio every evening, taking notes with pencil stubs on scraps of paper, documenting everything Preston said. Looking for clues. Looking for answers. He mentioned B-17 maintenance procedures, Morrison said one night after a broadcast. Specific details about the Norden bomb site. That's classified information. He's giving them intelligence. Or he's being forced to, Wade replied. But Morrison wasn't convinced. You hear how he sounds? He's not reading from a script. He's comfortable. He's conversational. That's not a man with a gun to his head. Sullivan disagreed. You don't know what they're doing to him. We don't know what he's been through. The arguments went on every night. Some men defended Preston, insisted he must be under duress, forced to broadcast against his will. Others called him a traitor, said no amount of torture justified what he was doing. Wade tried to stay neutral. He'd learned in 4 months as a prisoner that judgment came easier than understanding. Everyone had a breaking point. Everyone had limits. The question was what happened when you reached them. In early November, the broadcasts changed. Preston's voice became more personal. He started telling stories. About his childhood in Nebraska. About learning to fly in Pensacola. About the friends he'd made in the service. He talked about specific people by name, mentioning their hometowns, their families, their favorite songs. And men in the barracks recognized those names. He just mentioned Lieutenant Frank Weaver, Sullivan said during one broadcast. Weaver was killed over Bougainville in August. How does Preston know that? Wade had no answer. But 3 nights later, Preston mentioned another name. This one alive. A pilot being held at a different camp 50 miles north of Omori. He talked about this pilot's wife, mentioned her first name, described the farm where they'd grown up together in Oklahoma. The next morning, guards came to the barracks and took 5 men away for interrogation. They were questioned about the pilot Preston had mentioned. About his training. His squadron. His missions. The guards already knew some of the answers. Preston had given them information. Now they wanted verification. The 5 men returned to the barracks 3 hours later. None of them had been beaten. They'd just been asked questions. Questions about people Preston knew. Questions Preston had apparently already answered. That's when Wade understood what was happening. Preston wasn't just broadcasting propaganda. He was helping the Japanese gather intelligence. He was using his knowledge of American personnel to help identify prisoners, track movements, document organizational structures. He was actively aiding the enemy. Sullivan refused to accept it. He's giving them names they already have. He's not telling them anything they don't know. How do you know? Morrison challenged. How do you know what he's told them? Because I know Charlie. He wouldn't collaborate. Not willingly. Then explain the broadcasts. Explain why he sounds so relaxed. Explain why he's not showing any signs of coercion. Sullivan had no answer. The broadcasts continued through November and December. Preston's voice became a fixture in the barracks. Some men stopped listening. Others couldn't help themselves. They needed to hear it, needed to understand it, needed to know how someone like them could end up on the other side. Wade listened every night. Not because he wanted to, but because he was trying to understand something fundamental about human behavior under pressure. Where was the line between survival and betrayal? How much could be forgiven in the name of staying alive? Christmas Eve, 1943. Preston's broadcast was different that night. Instead of jazz music, he played Silent Night. The German carols sung in English by an American voice on Japanese radio. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When the music ended, Preston spoke for 30 minutes. Not about the war. Not about military matters. About home. About memories. About what Christmas meant to him growing up in Nebraska. His voice was gentle. Nostalgic. Human. Men in the barracks cried listening to it. Not because it was propaganda. But because it reminded them of everything they'd lost. After the broadcast ended, Sullivan broke his silence. I don't know what happened to him, he said quietly. But something broke. Something fundamental. And I don't think he even knows it's broken. Wade understood what he meant. Preston didn't sound like a prisoner being forced to cooperate. He sounded like someone who had found a way to survive by redefining what survival meant. By convincing himself that what he was doing was acceptable. By creating a mental framework where collaboration became rationalized as self-preservation. It was the most dangerous kind of surrender. Not the surrender of the body. But the surrender of the conscience. January 1944. The Japanese guard started referring to Preston by a different name. The Yankee Voice. They talked about him with something that looked like respect. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He'd become useful. Wade learned through whispered conversations with other prisoners that Preston was being held at a facility in Tokyo proper. Not a prison camp. A broadcast facility. He had his own room. Regular meals. Medical care. He worked with Japanese propaganda officials, scripting broadcasts, recording programs, helping produce the content that went out across the Pacific to Allied forces and prisoners of war. He'd been given a choice. Cooperate or go back to the camps. He'd chosen cooperation. In February, Sullivan received news through the prison grapevine. His younger brother had been captured in the Marshall Islands. Was being held at a camp in northern Japan. Sullivan hadn't seen his brother in 2 years. Didn't know if he was alive or dead until that moment. 2 weeks later, Preston mentioned Sullivan's brother by name during a broadcast. Talked about where he was being held. Mentioned that he was alive, injured but recovering. Said Sullivan shouldn't worry, his brother was being treated well. Sullivan listened to the broadcast with an expression Wade couldn't identify. Relief? Anger? Gratitude? Maybe all three. That night, Sullivan said something Wade would never forget. I hate him for what he's doing. But I'm glad he told me about my brother. That was the problem with Preston's broadcasts. They weren't purely propaganda. Mixed in with the demoralization and the lies were real pieces of information. Names of captured pilots. Conditions at other camps. Messages from home that the Red Cross hadn't been able to deliver. Preston was using his knowledge to help men. And he was using that help to justify his collaboration. The line between aid and betrayal had become impossible to see. In March, the interrogations intensified. Guards started asking prisoners specific questions about people Preston had mentioned. About squadron structures. About training procedures. About technical capabilities of American aircraft. Some men answered truthfully. Some lied. Some refused to speak at all. But the pattern was clear. Preston's broadcasts were being used as a tool. A way to verify information. A way to build profiles of captured personnel. A way to exploit the psychological impact of hearing an American voice tell other Americans their country had forgotten them. And it was working. Wade watched as morale deteriorated through the spring. Men who had resisted interrogation for months started talking. Started sharing information they'd kept secret. Started believing that cooperation might be rewarded with better treatment, with news from home, with some small relief from the endless deprivation and uncertainty of captivity. Preston's voice had become permission to give up. In April, Morrison was interrogated about technical details of the B-17's defensive systems. He refused to answer. Was beaten for 3 hours. Returned to the barracks with 2 broken ribs and a swollen jaw. That night, Preston's broadcast mentioned Morrison by name. Said he hoped Morrison was recovering well. Said the Japanese guards had told him about the interrogation. Said Morrison was a brave man, but bravery without wisdom was just stubbornness. Suggested that cooperation wasn't betrayal. It was survival. Morrison listened to the broadcast in silence. When it ended, he looked at Sullivan and said, "Your friend is killing us." One broadcast at a time. Sullivan didn't disagree. By summer, Preston's broadcasts had expanded. He was on the radio twice a day. Morning and evening. His programs reached not just prisoners but Allied forces across the Pacific. American sailors heard him on ships. Marines heard him on island bases. His voice became synonymous with Japanese propaganda efforts. And the effect was measurable. Intelligence reports that later came to light showed that Preston's broadcasts had contributed to decreased morale among captured and deployed personnel. His personal knowledge of American military culture made his propaganda more effective than anything the Japanese could have produced on their own. He wasn't just a broadcaster. He was a strategic asset. In July, Wade was transferred to a different camp. Before he left, Sullivan asked him a question. "If you see him after the war, what will you say?" Wade thought about it. Thought about the man who had spent a year broadcasting for the enemy. The man who had given away intelligence, aided interrogations, undermined morale. The man who had also passed along messages to prisoners about their families, who had mentioned Sullivan's brother, who had provided some small comfort mixed with his propaganda. "I don't know," Wade said finally. "I honestly don't know." Sullivan nodded. "Neither do I." August 1945. The war ended with 2 atomic bombs and an imperial surrender. Prisoners were liberated from camps across Japan. Men who had spent years in captivity finally went home. Charles Preston was arrested on August 20, 1945, by American military police at the broadcast facility in Tokyo. He was 32 years old. Had been a prisoner for 3.5 years. Had been broadcasting for 2 years and 11 months. He was charged with treason. 7 counts. Aiding the enemy. Providing intelligence. Broadcasting propaganda. Undermining American military morale. The trial began in San Francisco in March 1946. Sullivan testified. Morrison testified. Wade testified. Dozens of former prisoners testified about the broadcasts, about the interrogations, about the psychological impact of hearing an American voice tell them their country had abandoned them. Preston's defense argued coercion. Said he'd been forced to broadcast under threat of execution. Said he'd had no choice. Said survival wasn't treason. But the prosecution presented evidence that contradicted the coercion narrative. Testimony from Japanese guards who said Preston had been treated well. Better than other prisoners. Given regular meals, medical care, comfortable quarters. Records showing he'd been paid a small salary for his work. Letters he'd written to Japanese propaganda officials suggesting new broadcast ideas. The picture that emerged wasn't of a man forced to cooperate. It was of a man who had chosen cooperation and then rationalized that choice until he believed his own justifications. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Guilty on 5 counts. Not guilty on 2 where the evidence of coercion was ambiguous. Preston was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Sullivan attended the sentencing. Sat in the courtroom and watched as his former roommate was led away in handcuffs. Afterward, reporters asked him how he felt. "I don't know," Sullivan said. "Part of me thinks he deserved it. Part of me thinks he was just trying to survive. Part of me is grateful he told me my brother was alive. It was the most honest answer anyone gave during the entire trial. Preston served 8 years. Was released in 1954 with time off for good behavior. Moved to Oregon under an assumed name. Worked as a clerk in a hardware store. Never spoke publicly about his experience. He died in 1978. His obituary made no mention of the war. Among former prisoners, opinions about Preston remained divided for decades. Some viewed him as a traitor who had betrayed his fellow servicemen for personal comfort and safety. Others saw him as a survivor who had made impossible choices under impossible circumstances. Still others recognized that the truth was probably somewhere in between, that human behavior under extreme duress rarely fit into neat moral categories. The broadcasts themselves became case studies in psychological warfare. Military intelligence analyzed them, trying to understand why Preston's propaganda had been more effective than traditional Japanese efforts. The conclusion was simple. Authenticity. Preston hadn't been pretending to be American. He was American. His knowledge of American culture, military procedures, and personnel made his broadcasts credible in ways that scripted propaganda could never be. And credibility was the foundation of effective demoralization. In the decades after the war, similar cases emerged. American servicemen who had collaborated with the enemy. Some during World War II. More during the Korean War. Even more during Vietnam. Each case raised the same questions Preston's case had raised. Where was the line between survival and betrayal? How much collaboration could be forgiven in the name of staying alive? When did adaptation become capitulation? The military never found satisfying answers. In 2019, a researcher at the National Archives discovered Preston's personal diary from his time in Tokyo. The entries covered his first 6 months of broadcasting. They revealed a man struggling with what he was doing, questioning his choices, trying to convince himself that passing along news about prisoners' families justified the propaganda he was being required to deliver. One entry, dated January 1944, read, "I tell myself I'm helping these men by giving them information about their brothers and sons. But late at night, I know what I'm really doing. I'm helping the enemy break them. And I'm doing it because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop." It was the confession of a man who understood his own moral compromise but couldn't find the strength to resist it. The diary was never published. The family requested it remain sealed. The request was honored. Sullivan lived until 2003. In his final interview, conducted for an oral history project, he was asked about Preston. "I spent years being angry at him," Sullivan said. "Thought he was a coward. A traitor. Someone who had sold out everything we stood for. But the older I got, the more I wondered what I would have done in his place. Would I have been stronger? Would I have refused? Would I have found some way to resist?" He paused. "I'd like to think I would have. But I'll never know. And neither will anyone else who wasn't there." It was the most generous assessment Preston would ever receive from someone who had heard those broadcasts in the barracks at Camp Omori. The legacy of Charles Preston isn't about propaganda or collaboration or even survival. It's about the impossibility of judging choices made under circumstances most people can't imagine. It's about the way trauma and fear can reshape conscience until survival becomes its own justification. It's about the recognition that human behavior under extreme duress doesn't follow the rules that govern ordinary life. And it's about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the people who betray us are the same people who, in some small way, help us. On quiet evenings, when the radio played American jazz over Tokyo Bay and 200 prisoners listened to a voice they recognized, they weren't just hearing propaganda. They were hearing the sound of a man breaking in slow motion. They were hearing what happens when the choice between living and dying becomes confused with the choice between right and wrong. They were hearing their friend. And they couldn't believe it was him. But it was.